Well, welcome to our session on recession, retention and restructuring today. My name is Helen Beech and I am the Head of Employment at Clarkslegal, and I'm joined today by Angela Williams, who is our Senior HR Consultant at Forbury People. I'm going to be taking the legal topics today on the restructuring and redundancy aspects of this talk, and Angela's going to hopefully take the more positive side of attraction and retention. We're going to hopefully have about 45 to 50 minutes for the talk, and then hopefully we have 10 minutes at the end for a couple of questions. We'll also send out all the slides at the end of the talk, and we also have top 10 tips. It's a hard thing to say at the end that we'll send out to you today at the end of the session. So to start with, what I wanted to talk about was the legal parts of this talk, and I'm going to just cover, these are the sorts of things that we're going to cover in today's session. And I'm going to start off with the P&O Ferries case and the new code of practice. And what I wanted to deal with was some of the issues around redundancy and restructure in what is probably going to be quite a challenging 12 months, particularly for the HR profession. So the P&O Ferries case, which most of you will have read about, that was back at the beginning of the year, I think was probably the high point in employer failure to do the right thing. And Angela will be able to tell you a little bit about this case as well, because she was actually called in as an HR professional to assist with this, and she will not claim credit for what happened in that case at all, because she walked away from it. But actually, I wanted to talk a little bit about the concept of fire and rehire, because there may be pressure in a recession to actually get things done quickly and to make changes quickly. And as part of a restructuring process, there may be demand to make changes to the way things are done, to the way that you reorganize, and to the way that you structure the business. And that pressure may come into HR departments from the board, or actually from head offices and from parent companies that may even not be based in the UK, and so may not be particularly au fait with some of the legal niceties and the processes that are demanded of us within our legal system. And it's, you know, there's sometimes a balancing act that has to be played out here, and it's what are you going to do and how is that going to play out, and how does it play out with some of the things that Angela's going to talk about, where there is such a difficulty with getting talent into a business at the moment and attracting talent. So the P&O Ferries case you'll all know about, because it was where the 800 staff were terminated, and it wasn't quite the normal fire and rehire, because they didn't rehire, they actually replaced with cheaper foreign labour. And there was absolutely no collective consultation. And this was pressure from the parent company, because they were making huge losses year on year. And in that case, there was simply a risk analysis, a cost analysis of the risks against the costs of continuing. And they decided that actually it was worth sacking everybody, replacing them with the very cheap labour. I think it was about £5 an hour in that case. And simply doing that. And the legal analysis that had to be considered was the risk of the unfair dismissal claims, and then the termination and re-engagement issue, which is where you have to have some other substantial reason for that dismissal, and maybe deciding that they actually didn't have a good case, and then the protective awards and the notice pay, and balancing that out and deciding that it wasn't, actually worth going through that process. And so that is an analysis that can be done. And I'll come on to the reasoning behind that and that SOSR, because actually I don't think it's a great SOSR. And if somebody is looking at restructuring because it's a question of trying to save costs on salary, I do not think that this is the actual answer to that. And I'll come on to that in a minute. But actually, when you think of that case, the fallout was way more around the brand and reputation. So whilst you can pay out and do that risk analysis, and you can pay out those claims, which they did, and I think they only had one claim arising that wouldn't be paid off, which was settled only a couple of weeks ago. The issue is about the brand and reputation damage that comes with not following processes and not consulting. and the bigger damage. And if you think of the P&O name now, you know, from a customer point of view, what do you think? And do you think that actually, well, would I go with that company? And do they actually use cheap labour? And how well are they trained? And what are the health and safety risks of going in that boat, ferry, whatever? But also from an employee perspective, looking to go and work for that organisation, would you want to work for them? Because if something else happened as we go through challenging times, how would I be treated? So in the P&O ferries, of course, what happened as a result of that was there was a huge amount of hand-wringing in the press and with the unions and the government around, you know, this was absolutely outrageous and this is not something that big companies or any company should do. Well, it's not a new concept. It's actually something that has been around for many, many years, and I myself have used that concept to deal with restructuring processes, but not in the way that P&O ferries did it. P&O ferries did it about changing pay, and I do not think that that is something that I have ever, in my career, tried to change pay by doing it that way, and I do not think that it would ever stack up as a good SOSR defense in a restructuring process. You either are making redundancies in terms of saving the costs, or you are looking at this as a last resort in terms of having to make significant organisational changes that are looking at the way the operation works. It's looking at major changes to the shifts, to the flexibilities that you need, to the way that the customers are driving how the business needs to reorganise and change. And there was quite a lot of talk around, you know, during COVID that, you know, it was used as a mechanism during COVID to make significant changes, and it was abused during COVID. And again, when you looked at how it was used during COVID, again, a lot of it was around because of changes in customer demand and what customers needed, because the demand went down in so many circumstances that actually the way companies needed to operate changed. So it wasn't just about pay. And so if you're looking at this fire and rehire concept, I think it has to be in circumstances where you are looking at much more than pay. The way you operate may involve changes to pay and the structure of pay and how things may pan out for individuals, but it shouldn't be just in the way that P&O did it. And I think P&O was such a watershed because it was such a huge company, and you know, it was such the way it did it on such a large scale, that it was such a watershed. So the new code, in terms of how is that going to be reflected and what is it going to reflect? Well, I'm not sure it's going to make a massive difference in terms of when it is published. If it's published, you can see there that I've said it's when parliamentary time allows. Well, goodness knows when that will be with this current government and all the things that it has to deal with at the moment. But it's going to detail how businesses should consult and the practical steps they have to follow regarding a fair and transparent process. I actually think that when companies follow this process, they actually do know what it means, and that we do consult and we do it properly. And when they take advice, you know, lawyers actually know the concepts behind this consultation process, and it generally is a last resort. I think the problem with the process is that because it involves minimum statutory consultation processes of 30 or 45 days, depending on the numbers that are involved, that it means that you do start that process very early. And so it can tend to feel quite threatening because you have to get those steps in and you start those steps quite early. And so it feels to the individuals involved that you're sort of making those threats very early on in the process when actually you're trying to consult. And so I think there's a real need for HR to communicate really well with staff about what you're trying to achieve, and that the end game isn't to try and terminate everybody, that there is a much bigger sort of process and need to collaborate about the changes that are needed. So I think that's really important in these challenging times. But the big issue I think that will come here when we do get this code published will be around the penalties and seeing if those make a difference, because it's not quite clear yet whether this 25% uplift relates solely to unfair dismissal or whether it's going to also cover the protective award as well. And bearing in mind that the protective award is also on, is a third of someone's gross salary, effectively, for every affected employee. That is potentially, depending on the numbers you're talking about, can be a massive award. So if you're talking about 25% uplift on top of that, that is huge. So it's a concept that is not new, and I'm not sure the extent to which this code is going to change things, but if you are looking at it in these challenging times, I think you need to look at it very carefully. And I think that, P&O was a bit of a watershed and was perhaps a rare circumstance and should not be used for looking at just changes to pay. Okay. So restructuring generally and your legal obligations. I do think that this may be a time for HR departments to look at thinking around audits and looking at your contracts and knowing what you have got. Because when you get to challenging times and boards wanting to look at restructuring and making changes and wanting to do things rapidly to save costs, that they immediately look at redundancy processes, the costs of those, doing things that, have a very negative context. But actually having an audit and knowing what your contracts allow you to do without actually having to go even into a consultation redundancy process, can be really helpful. And I think there's often a case that you don't know until you go into a restructuring process. You don't even know what your contracts say and allow you to do. And so knowing the flexibilities that are available to you within the contracts can be really, really helpful. And they may even help you with your numbers game. So when you're looking at whether or not you're in a collective redundancy process, so whether you're, I've put there on the slide that whether you're at 20 or more redundancies that engages the statutory consultation obligations, it may be you're not if your contracts allow you the flexibilities to do what you want to do. So if you need to actually look at, changing the way that you work or the way that the hours that need to be done or the shift patterns, if it means that you can actually get those changes in without going into a restructure or redundancy process that involves collective consultation, then it's something that you should look at. And it might be that you have a real range of contracts from people who've got long-standing service, and so very old contracts that perhaps don't have flexibilities in them. So know your contracts, and it may be looking at that audit process now and understanding it is a really helpful thing to do. And also looking at your template. So when you are recruiting or you're promoting or moving people around, have a really good template contract in place so that those flexibilities are written in, having layoff provisions written in so that you can utilize those when you need them. Do not forget that if you are using express terms that allow you some flexibility, that the implied duty of trust and confidence overlays those express terms. So it doesn't mean to say that just because you have an express term that you can immediately do what you like with it. It may be that, of course, express terms around mobility are really helpful because they may avoid a redundancy process completely. If you're coming up for, lease renewals, or you can get out of a lease and move premises, which a lot of people are doing now with hybrid working. They do not need the properties that they're in, and they are reducing in size, and they can move people around. Having good mobility clauses in contracts actually helps because you may not have to make somebody redundant with the closure of a workplace now if you have a good mobility clause. But at the end of the day, trust and confidence overlays that express term. So, it doesn't mean to say you can't use it, but actually you have to make sure you don't breach trust and confidence. And so there is still some consultation that has to take place. You cannot impose that express term in such a way that it means that the employee cannot comply with the contract. So if you ask somebody to move overnight, that would be a breach of express term, the implied term of trust and confidence. They have to be able to, actually do the move in a sensible way. And you have to take into account personal circumstances. So things like childcare will all come into play into that. I put in there the statutory obligations, so be aware of those. But again, it may be you can look at establishments, and that may reduce the numbers game down if you have various establishments, and you can actually say that we're looking at numbers at different establishments, and so we may not be at 20 or more if we are looking at redundancies over a number of establishments. And remember, of course, that you have to still do your individual consultation. Just because you are in collective consultation does not mean to say that you are not doing individual consultation as well. It is not an obligation that is completely avoided because of collective consultation. And again, it's advising boards and parent companies that there are criminal sanctions against individuals and unlimited fines that are possible if you completely ignore your collective consultation obligations. And whilst there have been no actual prosecutions to date, there have certainly been charges brought against individual directors and cases brought, even though they've not been successful on the factual basis. But it's not something that you would want on your CV, either as an individual director or as a company. So actually sort of not going through those collective consultations, is actually quite damaging to an organisation. So on the consultation obligations, managing the processes efficiently can be helpful in challenging times that we may be going through. And certainly being able to report that to boards from an HR perspective is really helpful. I have put in there, think about elected forums for your statutory consultations, but not just for statutory consultation, but for all purposes. And I raise this because it's something that perhaps, as a firm, we talk about quite a lot with many of our clients to think about and keep thinking about as something that you can do. And it doesn't matter what size organisation you are. This is a really positive thing to be thinking about and to have in place ready for consultations that you might be obligated to do. Because if you have to elect reps, that takes time if you're going into a collective consultation for whatever purpose, whether it's to change terms and conditions or whether it is to go through a redundancy process. And it's also seen as a very negative thing. Whereas if you have actually a standing body in place, it can be a really positive thing. And having a standing body in place, not just for the statutory purposes, but for all sorts of consultations that you can have with your employees on health and safety, on your corporate responsibility, on all these various things where you can communicate with staff on your hybrid working, which we'll come back to in a minute. It's a really positive thing to have. And bear in mind that if we get a Labour government in 2 years' time, which seems a high probability, employee representation is something that they will be championing. They are talking around, having employee reps on boards. So actually having that strength of employee representation in the workplace is something that is a really positive thing to be doing. So that's just something to think about, in advance. And then also in collective consultation, just bear in mind about efficiency of processes. You can absolutely run individual consultations concurrently with the collective process, provided that you have got to the point where you can agree with the reps that the individual consultation processes can start to run. It may be that you have agreed pools, you've agreed selection matrix with them, and so you can get on with the individual consultations. You don't have to wait till the 30 days or 45 days is up. So you can get those processes running concurrently, which clearly means that the processes can finish earlier. You can run notice periods concurrently with a statutory consultation process. There's been over the years, a lot of debate and challenge around whether you can do that or whether you have to wait until, for example, the 45 days is up before you can serve notice periods. You can actually serve them earlier. Again, you get agreement from the reps to do it, and you make sure that the notice period does not expire before the end of the 45 days or the 30 days, whichever it is. But it does mean that you can get those notice periods running, and you can, again, an organisation may save money by doing that. And then on individual consultations, you can clearly seek volunteers, and that can avoid a process completely. And bearing in mind that you don't have to accept volunteers, so as long as you set out quite clearly you know, the terms on which volunteers may be accepted or not accepted, you may actually be able to avoid a process. So for smaller organisations or larger organisations, that can be a really good way of actually minimising processes. And also bear in mind, if you're going to make enhanced redundancy offers through settlement agreements, those can run concurrently with the process, with the consultation process. You do not have to wait for people to accept enhanced offers, that you're waiting 10 days, which is the sort of ACAS recommended time. You don't have to wait while people are deciding whether or not to accept an enhanced offer. You can have them running concurrently. You can get on with the process. You can still consult and let people decide whether or not they want to accept an offer or not. So you can speed up those processes. So actually, you know, in terms of trying to, you know, help a board or, you know, a parent company with actually doing things efficiently, you can, but it's actually not doing away with these processes because they're really important to individuals, that you are seen to be, you know, doing the right thing as well as doing the right thing, because those things play into what Angela's going to talk to you about around the organisation's brand and reputation, because those are absolutely critical. And I've said there, remember that everyone is an ambassador in your organisation. It's not just about the people that stay in your organisation, how they feel about you. Every person that leaves your organisation, in whatever circumstances they leave your organisation, they will go out and talk about your organisation and how you made them feel during a process. So even when you're having to deal with them in, you know, what may be very negative circumstances, is important. So I'm going to now hand over to Angela and get her to talk to you, hopefully, about what are perhaps more positive things, but I know can be very difficult for organisations in the current climate. So attraction and retention. Yeah, over to Angela.
Thanks, Helen, and hello, everybody. So the P&O case we talked about, I was involved a year before the decision was actually taken, and the requirement and discussion was all around the people actually don't matter. This is about how do we reduce cost and how do we make sure that we are running an efficient and cost-effective business. So profit over people. And I took the conscious decision that I was not prepared to follow an illegal process and risk the reputation of the business, risk my professional reputation, but also it was protecting, excuse me, the rights of the people to have a full consultation process. Now, obviously, we've seen the direct impact that that decision that was made a year later has had on all the people who worked for P&O, but more importantly, they are really, really struggling to recruit new people. Now, they've gone for an overseas workforce, but they do still need European and UK-based workers. They have a real attraction problem. They have obviously a retention problem, but more importantly, they have a brand reputation problem. And what I wanted to talk about was, you know, people now have a choice. We are in a very, very tight labour market. You may have seen today that unemployment is at the lowest rate that it has been in the last 30 to 40 years. And people now have a choice. The talent pool is really tight, and particularly when you're in an environment where you might be a small or medium-sized enterprise, you haven't got the flexibility of just throwing money at the issue. What you need to do is to be able to look at other opportunities. How do you make a career development genuine? And how do you create an environment that really works? A lot of people will say, you know, the number one reason someone will join an employer is because they pay well. Well, I can honestly say during this current period, how we've had to address some of the issues and some of the businesses that I've worked with and advised, we've had to go down the route of making one-off energy payments. So we can't afford a 5, 10, 20% pay rise. And I saw some of the settlements that are coming through recently are at 10, 15%. Unions, you know, will try very, very hard and rightly to push that up, but the ongoing cost base of the business makes it impossible. So how do you have a proposition that will give you flexibility? So, for example, and I'll come back to this in a second, and Digital, who I've worked with, they made a one-off energy payment at the beginning of October to help people to pay their energy bills. Huge retention, really positive feedback, but totally unaffordable to consolidate that into base pay. There's lots of different other options, flexible Fridays, 4-day working weeks, anniversary and birthday days off, development opportunities. Learning and development now is actually a key tool. So really focusing on what can differentiate you as an employer in a tough talent market is really what will help the business to thrive and grow and attract the right talent. In terms of the top 3 reasons why people join an organisation and why they stay, the first one is obviously pay and conditions. Am I going to be paid fairly for the job I do? But that's almost the ticket to ride, the entry point for an organisation. Number 2 is around clarity of purpose, creating a sense of belonging and create a sense of why are we different in this market. And then the third is around ESG, so environmental, social and governance standards that are operated within a business. Those are the reasons why Gen Z and Gen Y, but also why a lot of other generations are also saying why they will stay and why they will move and why they will join an organisation. So what I was going to do is just take you through very briefly how important this is. So the role of purpose in the employee proposition cannot be underestimated. Purpose is about why we exist as an organisation and why it's so important for the attraction and the retention of people is that this is why I belong. And belonging as a word is becoming more and more and more of an issue in people staying with an organisation. Do I feel that I can add value? Do I understand why we exist as an organisation, and can I align my life, my beliefs, my values with that purpose of the organisation? This costs no money. The most important thing here is around articulating why the organisation is important. The people team or the HR team plays a vital role in this. They're not only the guardians of a redundancy or an exit process, they're absolutely the guardians of the articulation of the purpose of the organisation. And it's a really great way to engage the board. Also linked to that are the cultures and values of the business. So it's a vital part of the employee value proposition. Culture is a word that's bandied around all over the place, but at its heart, it's around how we do things around here, how we operate, what our norms are, how we will treat each other, how we will behave, what are the goals, what's the code of conduct, what are the standards that we will work towards. And numerous new recruits, particularly the younger generation, will say in the interview, so what's it like? What's it like to work around here? How can I live my personality and what I can add value to the organisation in this organisation? What are you going to do for me? And what is the culture and how can I align with the purpose? And then the values which back up all of this is how people behave towards each other. And the number of employment cases where we have issues because it's the behaviour generally of leaders or managers that actually undermines the whole values and the norms and the culture that operate in an organisation. So making sure there is alignment between the purpose, the values and the culture really differentiate an organisation and make people want to stay. Now, there's lots of reasons why there will be an unhealthy culture or an ineffective culture. And anyone who's read Good to Great and seen all of the content that Jim Collins put into that book, these are generally the areas that he highlighted on why organisations have not survived and had longevity over a period of 30, 40, 50 years. The lack of customer focus, knowing who we are here for, the absence of pace and excitement within the business that we are actually making a difference, that people work in silos. Human beings love working together. and actually driving silos between them really makes the organisation ineffective, but also drives a sense of, well, what's the point? It will also, having poor and inconsistent communication undermines the cultural norms and the cultural behaviours. Everyone needs to be informed. They also need to feel that they are working in a transparent and open environment. A poor culture will increase attrition. It will drive down engagement. It will drive down a desire to be innovative, to be adaptive, to be flexible. And if we look at the COVID times, actually, COVID was a way of bringing people together and saying, actually, we don't need to put up with this anymore. We need to be engaged. We need to be transparent. There's great pace, and I know why I'm doing what I'm doing. But on the flip side, it's very easy to create a successful culture if you put these 9 key actions or activities in place. Have the values enshrined in everything, whether it's reward, recruitment, performance management. Make sure the organisation model is set up so that communication and flow and learning together, an agile organisation is created through that model. Making sure that new joiners know what's expected of them. There's absolute clarity and they are aligned with it. And this needs to be protected by an authentic leadership. There's no point the leadership saying, do this, and then they go off and demonstrate something else. It is really important that leadership is aligned and authentic. Yes, there's other things like coaching, making sure you have the right frameworks for development and performance management, that you celebrate and recognise success, and making sure that you have a proper, whether it's an academy or a learning and development provision, that personalises the experience within the employer. And then, as I mentioned, the third reason why people will join an organisation is what they do socially in a governance perspective and also environmentally. Are we making a difference to the future of the world? So bringing all of those together creates the classic service profit chain, aligning a brand with its purpose. So take the customer experience. Customers will pay more for a best experience, something that they can enjoy, something that they feel that they are valued and they are at the heart of what a business is trying to do. The only way you get a brilliant customer experience is through either great technology, but more importantly, employees who genuinely want to deliver that service to customers. And if you can bring those two together, the customer experience and the employee experience, you will drive exceptional financial performance. So a live example, I worked with British Airways, and I'll come back to this in a second. Their customer net promoter score was negative. Their employee experience or employee engagement level was at 14%, and their financial performance was not going well. This was all pre-COVID. What we did was invest in what is the customer experience that the customer actually wants. And we drove through training, development, but also the proposition itself, a positive and very positive customer NPS score. That was supported by an employee experience. So we increased employee engagement through a lot of activities from 14% to 62% in 9 months. And as a result, at that year end, the financial performance was the highest that it had ever been in the history of BA. So linking those two together, all aligned around a common purpose, is really, really important. So I'm just going to briefly touch on some examples where purpose and brand have really led to retention and attraction. And Digital is a new business. It's a small enterprise. When I joined, it had 30 employees. It now has over 1,000. And their whole purpose is to bridge the digital skills gap. And they deliver consultancy on digital transformation. But what they've done is set up clubs and hubs where people will come together as employees and as consultants with multiple skills to solve the customer problem. And we have a very flexible reward program that's been put in place. But the real reason people stay is that they are delivering solutions that will bridge the digital skills gap and genuinely make a difference to the wider world. And yes, there's lots of different employment. Yes, you have to pay them correctly, but the and digital experience is all around, we are delivering a purpose. And they run an engagement score called Illume, which is well over 90%. So engagement, employee engagement, customer satisfaction is incredibly high, and they have grown the business significantly. And COVID has helped because a lot of people need a lot of digital change. If you take Which, their original purpose was to provide advice and lobbying for customer protection. All on Which magazines, and anyone whose grandma or granddad had the Which magazine, it was seen as an old person's business. But actually, through completely revolutionising the people proposition, the service offer, and what the customers actually want, they are now a full multi-channel digital business with highly engaged people, high engagement in terms of change, and incredibly agile in that they work in a totally agile environment. And their reward packages and how they attract and retain people is completely focused on how are we inclusive, how are we making a difference to the wider world, and giving advice and lobbying and protecting consumer rights. If you look at Post Office, so a horrible history over the last 10 years, terrible things that happened to postmasters, which are now being dealt with through the inquiry. But underlying all of that, there was a reset, and I was lucky enough to be involved in this reset, where we needed to transform the culture, the values, the behaviours to really focus on postmasters. At the heart of that business is a purpose to deliver in-person services to every community across the UK. Massive business, 60-odd thousand postmasters, and an organisation that hadn't really changed that much until this horrible issue happened 2 or 3 years ago. And focusing and redefining the purpose. Why are we here? We are here for postmasters to deliver in every community and make a difference to people's lives. And through COVID, if you take the terrible Grenfell fire, but post offices set up and have the autonomy to be able to deliver local services, provide cash, provide access by giving autonomy. And the culture was all around, we are giving you the power to deliver those local services in the community. And so the trust and the trust index and the brand trust, despite what has happened with the old postmasters and the old business, is now at the highest that it has ever been. People do trust the post office to be at the heart of their community and deliver a range of services. If you look at BA on a massive scale, I've talked very briefly around this service profit chain, but there had to be a reset to be able to drive that level of engagement and that level of profitability and customer engagement. We had to completely reset the service and trust and purpose of the organisation. And so I'm just going to talk you through the work that was done through the organisation, and every single member of the team, all 30-odd thousand people, were involved in the delivery of this. And it looks very simple, but if we start at the bottom, we focused on what are our values. We called them commitments, but what are our values that we will hold true in everything we do and how we reward. So be safe and secure always. Everyone expects to get on an airline and be safe in the same way as they expect to get on a P&O boat and be safe. But being safe and secure always is at the heart of the culture. Being really genuinely passionate about service makes a difference to the customers. Having confidence that the service that we are offering is really what the customers wanted, and then being trusted advocates of BA. So this was for all our people, that they are trusted to make the right decision in the moment. And who were we doing this for? We were doing it for customers, for our people, and for our shareholders. So again, the service profit chain. If the customers are happy and our people are delivering a brilliant service, then the shareholders will get their return and get their value. And that was done by mapping the customer experience at every stage of the journey and aligning the employee experience with that customer experience. So what do we want our customers to do and feel from the moment they book their flight all the way through to getting their baggage at the end of the day? And what do we want our people to do to deliver that service? Obviously, the network, we need to make sure we fly to the right places that people want to go, and we are running an efficient business. And together, the purpose was around being the airline that was able to connect Britain with the world and the world with Britain. So it was a two-way thing. And above all of that, the purpose and our vision was to be the best airline in the world. This got people really, really excited and really aligned. And obviously through COVID, things have been difficult and it's been really challenging for the airline. But at that time, that enabled us to really align the whole organisation and, as I said, drive the highest profit that has ever come into the business. But the whole centre of it was everyone's aligned with the purpose, everyone knows why they are there and what their role is in being able to deliver success. So just as a takeaway from all of this, in this tight talent market, everyone has a choice of where they want to work and where they can work and where they will feel a sense of belonging. The employer value proposition needs to be really clearly articulated. This is our promise, and we need to make sure that what we say, what we do, and how we lead is totally aligned. And the HR team and the people team play a vital role in influencing the board to be able to do that.
Okay, so thank you, Angela, for that. We're going to just conclude on looking at hybrid working, which again is an issue that is cropping up with regard to attracting new talent into businesses and retaining talent, and just thinking about where is it going and what's happening with the hybrid working. It is the new norm for many sectors. And does it give you a competitive advantage? I guess that is the question that many people may be asking, that is it something that you have to offer, should offer? There are many organisations that may feel that it's not something that works for them. Does it differentiate you anymore in the working world? And so I've just flagged there a few issues to be thinking about. But in particular, there needs to be, I think, to hybrid working a real strategic approach. I think it's very easy to write a hybrid working policy, issue it, and then think we're done. And this point around that I put there, the last point on the slide, that not one size fits all, is a really critical point, because if you have a hybrid working policy that literally says, well, everybody is in 3 days a week and everyone works 2 days at home, that's not really a very strategic approach to hybrid working. And Angela's going to comment a little bit around the people, personalities and hybrid working, because I think that's really important to not only look at the personalities, but actually about what you do and how you do it and the type of work that you do. Because you have to actually start thinking around meeting people's personal preferences, but the team and the organisational needs, and those can be very different right across an organisation. And so if you literally just have a one size fits all, and that, when people come in, they come in and they are sitting at a computer and they don't actually speak to anybody all day, then there is probably something wrong with your hybrid working policy, and it probably isn't a differentiator, and it doesn't make a difference to somebody's life, because what are they doing that is different in the office that they could be doing at home? They could be saving on, travel costs and goodness knows what else. And so, it's thinking around those things. However, hybrid working clearly does have many advantages in the fact that you can cater for a huge amount of diversity, levelling up, engaging with people that you may not, just because of location, that you would not have had in the organisation before. But there does need to be a lot of thought around supporting the need for conversation, social interaction, development, reward, achievement? Do your remuneration policies actually work now for the ways that people are working and the output? And also, does your investment in IT actually meet the needs of home working? There's been a lot of sort of managing during COVID, and because everyone suddenly started working at home, perhaps in a rush, and so perhaps some of the IT and security systems were not in the best place. ACAS have actually recognised now, setting out, that there is a code. There is a code setting out what policy content you should have for hybrid working policy, dealing with complaints, health and safety requirements, setting out the importance of clarity, having trial periods, exclusions, flexibility. Not everybody can do hybrid working, and certainly I think trial periods are critical. Having inductions, people that are new in the business, hybrid working may not be right. And for people that are actually, not performing well, to have people back in the office and having the ability to call people back in and having that written in quite clearly is really important. And I distinguish between having flexible working and hybrid working is very important. Flexible working involves contractual changes that are permanent to somebody's contract. Whereas hybrid working does not. So hybrid working is something that is, by agreement, and that can be changed, and it does not involve a change to your contract of employment. So distinguishing between those, I think, is really important. Hybrid working is not a right. And the policy should look at, there needs to be more management training around mental health and well-being. The policy says that actually, with more people working at home, there is scope for more mental health issues, and managers being confident that they can deal with those issues, including, something that perhaps you've never even thought of before, such as domestic abuse, where people are actually at home, and that there may be things that perhaps would have gone under the radar before that you have to be conscious of, and how would you deal with those issues? So the one size, doesn't fit all is something to be aware of. And I'm just going to get Angela now to have a quick look at a few other things around the employee proposition and hybrid working.
Yeah, and I've been lucky enough to implement 3 different hybrid working practices for 3 different businesses over the last few months. And the key to this is leadership and being absolutely clear on what is the business reason for why people either need to be in the office or can work in a hybrid environment. And on the screen you'll see, whether it's planning and workshops, ideas generation, specific learning and skills development, making sure that new starters are onboarded properly. It's really, really hard to onboard somebody if they can't meet the manager, or they can't see the work environment. They get a very tunnel vision and view of how the organisation is going to work. So onboarding is really important face to face. Networking, building teams, building that culture that I was talking about before. Interviewing. The number of people who say, oh, well, I haven't actually ever met someone that I've just recruited. Interview them, make sure that you really understand and you're able to articulate what the organisation is trying to offer. And meetings longer than 3 hours. Nobody is really capable of sitting in front of a screen for 3 hours and adding a lot of value. So getting people together, there's huge benefit. And also where there are performance issues, proactively dealing with them. So there's lots of different reasons, but what I've recommended to the organisations I've worked with is you have principles that are agreed by the board and by the executive on exactly why and how you're going to implement hybrid working. And also then looking at it through the lens of different personas. So Helen touched on this a little bit, but it's fine. There are a lot of organisations that are completely remote, and that's fine, but it's setting an expectation that you might need to come in once a month or once a quarter. You've then got the day trippers who, again, mainly are remote, but actually they need to collaborate on specific things. So actually they come in, and they come in 1 day a week, for argument's sake. Then you have the explorers who they have their primary office location, and they can have a blend of meetings and collaboration, and then they go home and they have their on-screen time. And then the networkers, where actually they need to be in the office, where they can focus in meetings and be online, but also they are able to collaborate and engage and need to be in 2 to 3 days a week. And then there's the anchors. So there are some roles where there is an operational requirement, they have to be in the office, or a security reason that they have to be in the office. And so there is an expectation that that is how hybrid working will apply to them. There's also young people who in COVID were balancing on the end of their bed in a bed sit. Their IT setup was terrible, their environment was terrible, and actually they desperately want to be in the office. So those are the people who can anchor an environment. But I think being flexible and making sure that there is flexibility of approach, but also managers are responsible for making sure this works. And the key balance is it is the employer's decision on what is appropriate to deliver the work for customers, and then making sure that there is flexibility and engagement in terms of how that is actually brought to life. In every interview I have done over the last 18 months, I've always been asked, what is your hybrid working policy? It is a key differentiator for attraction and retention, and also enabling a diversity of talent. But making sure the employer is clear on expectation and clear on their position actually makes the whole experience much more positive, and then aligns with the employer value proposition that we've talked about before.
Yeah, so I think there might be a tendency to just say our hybrid working policy is that, you know, people work 3 days at home or 1 day at home or whatever it may be, and it's just a set figure. Whereas actually when you look at this slide that Angela's produced, it's actually maybe your role is, you know, your role is actually an explorer role. And you may not phrase it like that, but actually it's when you look at the role, yes, we have a hybrid working policy, and yet your role is going to involve this. And, you know, it may be some debate around it, but actually you could have all of these roles within your organisation and all of this type of personas within the working environment, and then people may move, so that actually just because you've worked at home for the 1 to 2 days a week because you're an explorer, when you're promoted, you may actually go into a completely different type of role. So there's this strategy around hybrid working, and I think that because of COVID we all just went into everybody disappears and goes home. Actually now there needs to be some strategic thinking around how hybrid working actually works for people and for the business, and there needs to be some thought around it that perhaps there hasn't been, because we've just gone from this position that we were forced into this more strategic thinking. Yeah. So that's our talk. I know we have got time for hopefully maybe 1 or 2 questions. I can see that I've been sent a couple already. The first one's actually on hybrid working, which actually is, and this is an interesting one because this has always cropped up with regard to flexible working, which says, are you seeing any evidence of discriminatory behaviour relating to hybrid working, e.g. presenteeism being favoured regarding promotions, work allocations, bonuses, etc.? I think, Angela, you may have some comment, but from a legal perspective, I think my view on hybrid working at the moment is that there probably isn't enough statistical data at the moment. A lot of the statistical data we have a lot of data on flexible working, and we know that there are issues around flexible working relating to those with childcare arrangements, and that tends to be females. And so that's an indirect discrimination claim. I think all the data that I have read recently all stops around early 2021, so we haven't got a lot of current data, and so what you've got is that that's almost everybody was at home. And so I haven't got I don't think there's enough data at the moment to see what's happening where you've got these policies that now are perhaps more interesting in about how people are working and what it's looking like. But I can, we've always had this issue, and it will be interesting to see what happens, but I can see that there's if people just literally do everyone's at home for 3 days and in for 2 days, then it may be quite difficult to see what is the discrimination, because if you've got a whole workforce out and in, then where is your comparison? But what I can see is perhaps there would still be, for example, indirect discrimination claims arising and I can see it perhaps being more on grounds of things like age, because those that will thrive more at home will be the older generation who have already got their career on track, know what they're doing, are comfortable being at home and in the home environment, where it's the youngsters that may struggle more because they want that, they need that engagement, they need it for the development, and they don't get it. And I think there have been quite a few reports and analysis around what the younger generation need about that engagement and that onboarding and that feeling that that they do need to have that office environment. And so whilst they do want the flexibility of hybrid working, that they may struggle. And so it's the senior managers that are quite happy in certain circumstances to actually be working at home, and they've got a better working environment simply because they have nicer houses to be in, because they've got to that stage in their careers and their lives. So I can see that even if you have hybrid working where there's a fairly standard approach to who's at home and who's not, that you could have indirect discrimination claims. But I think it will be more age discrimination than the gender-based discrimination that we see perhaps with flexible working requests. So I don't think we have the data at the moment to help us.
Yeah, I mean, I've got some anecdotal, and it's quite interesting. So I don't think people are being put aside for promotion. However, the standard comments of, Angela, can you sort this out? These people should be in the office. We need to go back to how we were before. And if they're not in the office, they're not being as productive as I am when I'm in the office. And it's generally the older workers who have decided that they want to go back to how things were before, who aren't that flexible in terms of how they're working, and they are putting their old norms on what is acceptable and what's not acceptable. So I've had to push back on quite a few where you really genuinely can't say that. We have agreed as a senior team, this is how it's going to work. You now have an obligation as a manager to sort this out. But yeah, there are still quite a lot of old thinking of, well, if you're not in 2 to 3 days a week, then you're not going to be effective. And that is not the right way to go. So I haven't seen any claims. I haven't seen people being but I have seen bad reactions to comments like that, where people have said, well, hang on a minute, I thought we said we were going to have a hybrid working policy, and yet the leadership isn't necessarily aligned with it.
Yeah, so I haven't seen any claims yet, but I certainly anecdotally I've seen that. So on that question, and then perhaps I've got time for just one very short question on retention. It says, are there any quick fixes we can consider excluding pay increases to help retain staff? So that's one for you, Angela.
Yeah, so I think the genuine quick fix is managers having regular one-to-ones, setting clear objectives, aligning people with the purpose, and looking at career development and career paths. So making sure that people know, if I deliver this is how I can progress, how I can broaden my experience. That doesn't cost any money. And also active engagement and communication. So going silent is an absolute disaster. People want to feel that they are part of it, even if they're only getting half the story. But really important, open communication, clear career development, looking at learning and development opportunities, and active manager engagement.
Okay. So I think that's our session for today. I hope that you found it useful. We will send out all the slide deck for those that have attended, and there'll also, as I said, be a top 10 tips actually on attraction and retention. So thank you very much for attending.
Thank you.